The flight from Merrick City to Dunholm takes 2 hours and 20 minutes, depending on headwinds. I have made that journey probably 40 times in the past decade, back and forth for work, for my son's university visits in his first year, for a handful of occasions that each blur into the same memory of the same gray carpet in the same terminal and the same announcement about gate changes that nobody listens to. It is the kind of flight that has stopped feeling like travel and started feeling like a slightly uncomfortable room that moves. I board, I find my seat, I put my headphones in, I read or work or simply sit behind the noise cancellation and think about nothing in particular until the wheels touch down. On this particular Tuesday in October, I had the window seat in row 14. The aisle seat was occupied early by a man in a blue jacket who fell asleep before we finished boarding. The middle seat, 14B, between us, was one of the last to fill. I was aware of someone settling into it the way you are aware of peripheral movement when you are not quite looking. A presence, an adjustment of the shared armrest, the particular reconfiguration of space that happens when the last empty seat in a row becomes occupied. I did not look up. I had my headphones in and a document open on my phone, and no particular reason to acknowledge anyone. We took off. The city tipped away below us and flattened into the grid of itself, and then disappeared under cloud. The man in the aisle seat continued to sleep. The man in the middle seat, I was aware of him in the way you are aware of a room's temperature. Present without being the object of your attention, was quiet. No fidgeting, no reaching into the overhead bin every 20 minutes. He had the quality of stillness that experienced travelers develop. Containment, the ability to occupy space without announcing yourself. I appreciated it without registering it. 40 minutes into the flight, something changed in the stillness beside me. A slight shift in orientation. A presence becoming more directed, more focused, the way a room's temperature changes when someone opens a door somewhere in the house, even if you cannot hear the door itself. I felt it before I understood it. And then, close enough to be unmistakable through my headphones, the man in seat 14B said a word. He said, Nori. I had not heard that name in 30 years. My parents had called me that when I was a child. I do not even know when or why they stopped, only that by the time I was a teenager, it had already disappeared, replaced by my full name, and then by the names that friends and colleagues gave me, and my husband eventually adopted, and my son has only ever known me by. Nori. 4 letters. A name that existed only inside a specific room of my childhood, in a house in Sallow Creek, spoken by 2 people, my mother Harriet and my father Douglas, and no one else in the world that I had ever known. I took my headphones off. I turned and looked at the man in the middle seat properly for the first time. And the world rearranged itself in a way that I do not have exact language for, because there is no language for it. Because the thing that happened when I looked at him is not something that language was designed to carry. He was looking at me with an expression I can only describe as someone trying very hard not to cry. His eyes were my eyes. The line of his jaw was my jaw, rendered in a different register, heavier, more angular, but recognizable the way your own voice is recognizable on a recording, strange and familiar at the same time, both at once, inseparably. He was in his early 40s. He was looking at me the way you look at something you have been searching for long enough that when you find it, the finding does not feel real yet. He opened the front pocket of his bag without looking away from my face. He removed a photograph, small, slightly worn at the corners, the particular matte finish of photographs from the early 1980s, and placed it on the tray table between us without speaking. 2 children. A baby in each arm of a man I recognized immediately as my father, Douglas Vane, young and thinner than I had ever known him but unmistakably himself. My mother Harriet beside him, smiling the specific smile she smiled in photographs when she was genuinely happy rather than performing happiness for the camera, the closed-mouth one, the real one. and 2 babies, one in each of my father's arms. 2. I stared at that photograph for a long time before I could speak. When I did, my voice came out quieter than I expected. I said, "Where did you get this?" He said, "It is the only photograph I have of all 4 of us together. I have been carrying it for 2 years, trying to decide how to find you. My name is Lenora. I am 42 years old. I was told, before I was old enough to question anything, that I had been a twin, that my brother had not survived birth, that he had been a loss my parents had grieved and moved past and chosen not to speak of further. I had believed this completely, without examination, for 40 years. And at 30,000 feet on a Tuesday in October, on a flight I had made 40 times without incident, I discovered that the grief was not real. The loss was not real. The only thing that had not survived was the truth. I want to ask you something before I take you back to the beginning of this story. Have you ever been handed a piece of information that did not just change what you knew, but changed the shape of everything you thought you had already understood? Not a new fact that sat alongside your existing picture of the world, but something that required you to go back through 40 years of memory and understand all of it differently. Because that is what happened in seat 14A of a flight from Merrick City to Dunholm on a Tuesday in October. And I want you to understand what it felt like to hold that photograph before I tell you the rest. My mother told me about the twin when I was 5 or 6 years old. I'm not certain of the exact age, only that I was young enough that the information arrived in the way important information arrives for very young children, as a fact about the world that you absorb without the capacity to interrogate it, the way you absorb the name of a country you have never been to, or the rules of a game you have never played. She said, "You know that you were a twin?" And I said something childlike in response, "Yes," or "No," or "What is a twin?" And she explained it, briefly and with a gentleness that I remember more than the words. And she said that my twin brother had been very ill and had not been able to stay, and that it had been very sad, and that we were very lucky to have me. And then the conversation ended. It ended, and it never came back. Not once, in all the years of my childhood, did the subject surface again. Not at Christmas, not at birthdays, not in the ordinary conversations about family history that families have when they are sorting through old photographs or visiting relatives who remember when you were small. It was as though the twin existed only in that single conversation when I was 5 or 6, and then withdrew from the family's shared language entirely. I learned early not to raise it. Children are extraordinarily sensitive to the invisible boundaries around certain subjects in a household. They learn where the closed doors are not by being told, but by noticing what happens when they approach them. The twin was a closed door. I felt the closing of it, and I stayed away. I told myself this was normal grief, that parents who had lost a child would naturally not want to revisit that loss repeatedly, that asking would be unkind. I was a considerate child. I did not ask. My father, Douglas, died when I was 19, a heart attack, sudden, at 51 years old, a shock that arrived on an ordinary morning and divided my life into before and after. He was gone before I had grown old enough to ask him the adult questions I had begun to accumulate about my own history. He was gone before I understood that the closed doors of childhood do not have to stay closed forever. I have thought about this many times, about the questions I would have asked him, given time, about whether he would have answered them. My mother, Harriet, is 78 now, living in a care facility on the north side of Sallow Creek, in a room that looks onto a garden she cannot always identify, but that she seems to find peaceful regardless. She has an early-stage memory condition that affects her recent recall more than her older memories, which the doctors describe as typical for her type of diagnosis. She knows my name and my face. She knows my son's name. On good days, she is almost entirely herself, sharp and dry-humored, and still capable of finding the exact right word for a situation when she wants to. On harder days, she drifts, becomes circular, revisits the same worry from different angles without arriving anywhere. In the 2 years before the flight, her drifting had begun to include references I did not understand. She would say things like, "I told Douglas it was wrong," or "I never stopped thinking about the other one." Or once, sitting by the garden window with a cup of tea she had forgotten she was holding, "There were 2 of you, you know. There were always 2. Each time I gently tried to follow the thread, she would shift away from it, become vague, return to something more manageable. I had attributed it to the condition, the way memory becomes ungoverned when its usual guardrails begin to soften, surfacing things that were submerged, replaying things in a different order than the one they originally occurred. I had noted it and filed it and moved on. I had not known, sitting beside her in that garden-facing room, that she was not drifting. She was remembering. She was telling me, in the only way left available to her, something she had needed to say for 40 years. The twin I had been told about was a fact I carried the way you carry a fact about your own history that has no living texture to it, no memory, no story, no person attached. He had a presence in my life only as an absence, a shape in the negative space of the family that I had stopped looking at directly somewhere in childhood and had not looked at again. I did not grieve him exactly. I had been too young when I was told, and the telling had been too brief and too final for grief to form properly. What I had instead was a particular kind of vague, unattached sorrow, the kind you feel for something you never had the chance to lose, because you never had it to begin with. I had not known, for 40 years, that that specific sorrow had been unnecessary, that he was not gone, that he had simply been elsewhere, living a life I knew nothing about, sitting in a carpentry workshop 300 miles away, making furniture with his hands, and carrying a photograph in his jacket pocket, and trying, for 2 years, to figure out how to find me. His name was Callum Marsh. He told me that within the first few minutes of our conversation, before almost anything else, the way you tell someone your name when the name is itself the beginning of an explanation. He said, "My name is Callum. I believe, that we were born on the same day. I think you are my sister." He had been raised by Bernard and Eunice Marsh in a town called Fenwick, 300 miles north of Sallow Creek. Bernard had been an accountant, and Eunice had taught secondary school science, and they had adopted Callum as an infant from a private arrangement that they had been told and had genuinely believed was entirely above board. They had been childless for 11 years. They had hoped to adopt through formal channels and had found the process slow and uncertain. And when a contact of Bernard's from his professional network had mentioned an infant in need of a family, they had said yes before he had finished the sentence. They had told Callum he was adopted from the time he was old enough to understand what it meant. They had told him they knew very little about his biological family, only that he had been born in the South, that his biological parents had been unable to keep him, that the arrangement had been made with care. They had told him that if he ever wanted to search, they would support him completely. They were, he said, the best possible parents for the specific difficulty of being a child who knew there was a question behind them that they could not answer. He had not searched until he was 38. Not because he had not wondered, he had wondered his entire adult life, in the specific way of people who have an unanswered question about their own origins that does not go away, but also does not always demand immediate attention. He had wondered, and filed it, and lived his life, and worked, and built things with his hands, and made a home. And then, at 38, he could not explain precisely why 38 and not 35 or 40, something had shifted, and the wondering became more urgent. He had submitted his DNA to an ancestry database and begun the slow, administrative work of inquiry into his adoption records. The DNA database had returned something unexpected within 8 months. Not a parent, those records were older and harder to trace, but a close familial match. A first-degree relative, female. The profile had been uploaded 2 years earlier by someone using a student account, as part of what appeared to be a school or university genealogy project. That profile, he had eventually determined, belonged to my son. My son, who is 22 years old, and who had, apparently, submitted a DNA sample to an ancestry service as part of a cultural heritage assignment in his second year, and had never mentioned it to me because it had been a minor project that he completed and forgot about, not understanding that the sample he sent off in an envelope one Tuesday afternoon was also a beacon, broadcasting into a database that a man in a carpentry workshop in Fenwick was searching. Once Callum had the familial match, he had done what careful people do with incomplete information. He had moved slowly. He had traced the student account to its owner, and from there, through a series of steps that required patience and a great deal of sitting with uncertainty, he had found my name. He had found what public information existed about me. He had confirmed, through the DNA match and through what he could learn about my family background, that I was most likely the person he was looking for. He had then sat with that knowledge for 2 years. 2 years. He had written drafts of letters and deleted them. He had composed emails and not sent them. He had held the photograph, which had come with the adoption paperwork, given to Bernard and Eunice along with a small collection of documents that neither of them had fully understood at the time, and turned it over in his hands many times, and thought about what it meant to appear in someone's life after 40 years and say, "I think I am the person you were told did not exist." He had not planned the flight. He said this several times, as though concerned I would think the encounter had been engineered. It had not been. He was traveling to Dunham for work, a commission for a client, a large dining table that needed to be measured and discussed on site. The seat allocation was the airline's, automatic, random. He had looked at his seatmate while stowing his bag and had gone completely still. He said, "I stood in the aisle for a moment and I thought I might need to sit in a different seat. I was not prepared. And then I thought, if not now, when? If I walk past this seat, how long do I carry the photograph before I find the courage again?" So I sat down, and I waited until I was certain, and then I said your name. I want to ask you something about that word, courage, because I have thought about it a great deal since that flight. Callum had known who I was for 2 years. He had carried a photograph of both of us as infants in his jacket pocket and had not known how to cross the distance between knowing and saying. Have you ever known something important and been unable to find the moment to say it? Not from dishonesty, but from the specific fear of what saying it might change. And have you ever been on the receiving end of someone who finally found the moment? Because sitting in seat 14A with my headphones around my neck and a photograph on my tray table, I understood both sides of that question at the same time. We had 1 hour and 40 minutes left on the flight. I do not know what the appropriate response is to discovering that your twin brother is alive and sitting beside you in the middle seat of a domestic aircraft, and I suspect no one does, because it is not a situation for which anyone has had the opportunity to develop protocol. What we did was talk. Quietly, carefully, with the particular carefulness of 2 people handling something that neither of them has ever handled before, and that they are both afraid of dropping. I asked him about his life first, because asking about his life was easier than asking about the questions underneath it. He told me about Fenwick, a mid-sized town that he described with the mild, affectionate specificity of someone who has lived in the same place long enough to know its character without needing to romanticize it. He told me about Bernard and Eunice, who are both still alive and in reasonable health, and living in the same house he had grown up in, which he now lived 3 streets away from. He told me about the carpentry, how it had started as something practical, a way to earn money in his 20s while he figured out what he actually wanted, and had then simply become what he was, the way some things do when you are honest about where your attention naturally goes. He made furniture, he said. Tables, primarily. Big ones, the kind that families eat around for decades. He said this with a quiet satisfaction that I recognized, the specific contentment of someone who has found the work that fits them and knows it. I told him about textile design, about the patterns and the color and the endless conversation between structure and surface that had kept me interested in the work for 20 years. He listened with a quality of attention I found immediately familiar, though I could not have said why. It was only later that I understood. It was the same quality of attention I have, the same particular stillness when something genuinely interests you. I told him about my son, his name, his age, his course at university, the specific way he walks into a room. Callum listened to all of it and smiled at the detail about the walking, and I noticed the smile and filed it without yet understanding why it felt significant. He did not have children. He had been in a long relationship that had ended several years earlier without producing the bitterness that some endings produce. And he had made, he said, a certain peace with the particular shape of his life. He said it without self-pity, which told me something about him that a longer conversation might not have. And then, somewhere over the midpoint of the flight, with the cloud below us and the light coming through the window at the low angle of afternoon, we arrived at the question that had been sitting at the center of everything since he said my name. I asked it simply, because simple was the only register available to me. I said, "Do you know why?" He said, "I have some of it, not all. What I have from the adoption records is that the arrangement was private, that it was made before the birth, and that the name on the birth father's documentation is Douglas Vane." He said it with the care of someone delivering a weight that he has been aware of the heaviness of for some time and is placing down as gently as the weight permits. Douglas, my father, who had died at 51 without explaining anything, who I had mourned for 23 years with the uncomplicated grief of a daughter who believed she had known who her father was. I looked out the window for a moment. The cloud below us was solid and white and absolutely indifferent to what was happening in seat 14A. I told Callum about Harriet, about the care facility and the garden window, and the references that had seemed like confusion, but now, sitting here with the photograph on my tray table, rearranged themselves into something that was not confusion at all. I told him, "I think my mother has been trying to tell me for the past 2 years. I think the condition took some of her guardrails away, and what is left is the truth she was never able to say when she had full control of herself." Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you think she would see me?" The plane began its descent. Below us, the cloud broke apart, and Dunham appeared in pieces, the river first, then the grid of streets, then the particular cluster of the city center that I recognized from 40 approaches. We exchanged numbers at the luggage carousel, standing side by side with our bags at our feet, slightly stunned in the way that people are stunned when something has happened that is too large for the ordinary container of a day. He had a client meeting to go to. I had a hotel room. We said goodbye with the handshake and held eye contact for a moment too long, and then let go. I sat in my hotel room that evening and looked at the photograph he had sent to my phone before we parted, a high-resolution image of the original, every detail clear. My father's face, my mother's smile. 2 babies, 1 in each arm. I studied the babies for a long time, trying to determine which was which, and found that I could not. We were identical, or close enough to identical that whatever differences existed were not visible in the photograph. We were, at whatever age that photograph was taken, entirely and completely each other. I want to ask you something here about the 40 years between that photograph and seat 14A, about what it means to have lived a full life, a good life, A life that you built carefully and that works in all the ways a life can work, and then discover that it was built on a foundation with a room you did not know existed. Not a room that changes everything in the room above it, just a room that was always there, that had a person in it, that the people who built the house chose never to open. Have you ever found something like that? A truth that does not invalidate what you had, but simply adds a dimension you were never given the choice to know about. 3 weeks passed between the flight and the visit to Harriet. We used those 3 weeks carefully. Callum sent me copies of the documents from his adoption, not the originals, which he was cautious about posting, but clear photographs of each page, which I read at my kitchen table over 2 evenings, working through the bureaucratic language of private adoption records with the slow, close attention of a person reading something in a language that is almost but not quite their own. The documentation confirmed everything Callum had told me on the plane. The birth father's name, Douglas Vane, listed with an address in Sallow Creek that I recognized as the house I grew up in. The birth mother's name was listed not as Harriet Vane, but as Harriet Lowes, her maiden name, the name she had carried before her marriage and that she had, apparently, used to sign these documents. I understood, when I saw that, why the records had been difficult to trace. It was a small thing, a name, a version of her identity that was technically her own, and it had functioned, whether deliberately or by oversight, as a layer of distance between Callum and the family that had let him go. I also spoke with my son during those 3 weeks. I told him about Callum, about the flight, the photograph, the DNA match that had originated from his ancestry project. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "So I found him?" I said, "In a way, yes. You found him without knowing you were looking." He thought about that for a moment and then said, "Second. Just that. Good." And I held the phone tightly and did not cry, which cost me something. Callum and I drove to the care facility together on a Thursday morning. We had agreed in our phone conversations in the preceding weeks to be calm and careful and to follow Harriet's lead, not to push, not to present her with information as though it were an accusation, but simply to be present and to see what she did with our presence. We did not know how much she would remember. We did not know how much the sight of Callum would reach through the fog of her condition and connect to something older. She was in the garden-facing room, in her usual chair, with a cup of tea and a book open on her lap that she was not reading. She looked up when I came in, and her face did what it always does, a loosening, a warmth, the specific pleasure she takes in my visits that is entirely genuine and that I have never once doubted. I kissed her cheek. I pulled the second chair close, and then I said, "Mum, there is someone I want you to meet." And Callum came through the door. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, 5 seconds, 10, long enough that I became aware of the quality of the looking, the specific depth of it, the way it was not the politely interested look of someone meeting a stranger, but something more fundamental, more searching. And then something in her face changed. Something that had been held for a very long time released itself, quietly and without drama, like a breath that has been kept in a chest for 40 years finally let go. She said, clearly, without wandering, in the tone of someone resuming a sentence they began decades ago, "I told Douglas it was wrong. I said it every way I knew how to say it, and he would not hear me. And then one day I stopped saying it, and I have never forgiven myself for the day I stopped." The room was very quiet. The garden outside the window was doing whatever gardens do on a Thursday morning in autumn, being still, being ordinary, being entirely unaware of what was happening 3 feet away from it. I reached over and took my mother's hand. She looked at Callum and she said, I knew your face would look like that. I always knew. Callum sat down in the chair I pulled forward for him, across from Harriet, close enough that she could see him clearly. He did not say anything immediately. He just sat. And I think that sitting, the quiet, unhurried act of simply being present without demand, was exactly the right thing. And I think it told Harriet something about him that 100 words could not have told her as quickly. Before I tell you what Harriet said next, what she explained about where Callum was sent and why, in the clearest and most complete account she had given anyone in years. If you have found your way to this story, if it is sitting with you, please subscribe to this channel. Stories like this one arrive every single week. It is free and it takes 1 second. Now let me tell you what my mother said. I want to ask you something about that room before I tell you what came next. About what it means to be present when a secret that has been held for 40 years finally surfaces in the person who has been carrying it. Because I have thought about Harriet in that chair many times since that Thursday morning. And what I keep returning to is not the content of what she said, but the quality of her saying it, the relief in it, the specific release of someone who has been holding something for so long that the holding has become the entire shape of a part of them. And then the thing is finally set down, and they are still there. Still themselves, still breathing, still capable of reaching over and taking their daughter's hand. Harriet spoke for a long time that Thursday morning, with the clarity that sometimes visits people in the middle stages of her condition, long stretches of coherence that arrive unpredictably and feel, when they are happening, like a window opening in a house that has been shut up for too long. She did not speak without gaps or in a perfectly linear order. Memory does not work that way, even in its undamaged form, and hers was not undamaged. But the shape of what she told us was clear. I am going to tell it to you in the order I eventually assembled it, which is not exactly the order she told it, but which is the order that makes the most sense as a human story. When my mother became pregnant with us, my father Douglas was in the middle of the worst financial period of his life. He had started a small building supplies company in his late 20s, had run it successfully for several years, and had then made a series of investments and expansions that went wrong, in the compounding way that financial decisions go wrong when one misjudgment leads to another, and the error does not become fully visible until the damage is already significant. By the time Harriet was 6 months pregnant, Douglas was dealing with debt that he had kept from her entirely. Because he was a man of his particular generation and background, and men of his particular generation and background did not discuss financial failure with their wives, and they especially did not discuss it when the failure was their own. When the doctor told them it was twins, Harriet said Douglas had been quiet for 2 days. She had read his quietness as shock, the ordinary shock of parents confronting the doubled reality of what they had planned for one of. It was not shock. It was calculation. He had been working out in those 2 days what he could afford, and he had arrived at an answer that Harriet, when he finally told her, had refused to accept. He had told her they could keep 1 child. That 1 child was manageable, financially, given what he was dealing with. That 2 children were not. He had told her he had already spoken to someone, a business contact, a man who handled these kinds of arrangements quietly, privately, for families in difficulty, and that there was a couple who were willing and ready, and who would give a child a good life. He had told her it would be temporary, that when the finances improved, they would find a way to bring the 2nd child home. He had told her this as though it were a practical matter, a logistical decision, a problem to be managed. Harriet had said no. She had said it clearly and repeatedly and for weeks. She had said it with every version of the argument available to her, that they would find another way, that she would go back to work, that they would borrow, that they would move to a smaller house, that there was no financial difficulty that could justify what he was proposing. Douglas had listened to all of it, and then he had told her the full extent of the debt, all of it, the actual numbers, the actual situation. And Harriet had gone quiet. She had not agreed, she told us. She wanted us to understand that she had never agreed. But she had stopped fighting, which is a different thing from agreeing, though in its practical effect it is sometimes indistinguishable. She had stopped fighting because the weight of the debt and the weight of Douglas's certainty and the weight of her own fear had combined into something she could not find the strength to push back against, alone, at 8 months pregnant, in a house where the person she would normally have turned to for support was the person she was fighting. Callum had been handed to Bernard and Eunice Marsh 3 days after the birth. Harriet had held him once. She said this quietly, looking at her hands. And then she had not held him again. Douglas had told me, when I was 5 or 6 and old enough to be told something, that my twin had not survived. Harriet had not corrected him. That, she said, looking not at me but at the garden, was the thing she could not forgive herself for. Not the arrangement. She had been in an impossible position with that. But the lie she had told by her silence, every day for 40 years. She looked at Callum when she finished. She looked at him the way you look at something you have imagined so many times that the actual version of it is both exactly what you expected and nothing like what you expected at the same time. She said, "You have his hands. You have Douglas's hands." And there was something in the way she said it that was not simple grief. It was something more complicated. The specific emotion of a person who loved the man who did a thing that cannot be undone and has spent 40 years living in that contradiction. Callum reached across and took her other hand. The 3 of us sat in that room for a long time after that, with the garden outside and the tea going cold, and the specific silence of 3 people who have just arrived at a truth that took 40 years to reach and do not yet know what to do with it, except sit in the same room together and breathe. I want to ask you this about Douglas, about the man who made a decision I cannot excuse and who died before any of us could ask him to account for it. How do you grieve someone who loved you genuinely and also did something that causes you a specific, irreversible harm? How do you hold both of those things about the same person without resolving one into the other? I have been working on this question since the care facility, and I do not have a clean answer. I do not think a clean answer is available. What I have is the question itself, which I have stopped trying to dismiss and started trying to carry honestly. There is a certain kind of honesty that is only possible when you stop needing the answer to be simple. What follows a discovery like this is not a montage. It is not a dramatic reunion with swelling music and tears and a moment of resolution that contains everything. What follows is ordinary time, weeks, then months, then a year, in which 2 people who have lived 42 years without each other, slowly and imperfectly, begin to construct something that has no template. A relationship between adult siblings who are strangers to each other is not like any other kind of relationship. It borrows from several and fits none of them exactly. You have a biological shorthand that bypasses some of the distance of unfamiliarity and does not bypass the rest. You have shared origins and no shared memories. You have the same face and entirely different lives. You have to build something, and you have to build it knowing that you are building it on a foundation that was supposed to be there from the beginning and was not. Callum came to Merrick City 6 weeks after the visit to Harriet. He stayed for a weekend. I showed him the city, the park near the river, the market on Saturday morning, the restaurant where my husband and I had eaten on our first date, which Callum found unreasonably interesting, in the way that people find things about your life interesting when they are trying to build a picture of who you are. My husband, who had known about Callum since the night of the flight, and who had responded to the information with the steady, practical warmth that is his greatest quality as a person, cooked dinner for 3 and found immediately that he liked Callum in the unpretentious way that you like someone who is simply, straightforwardly themselves. My son drove down from his university town that weekend specifically to meet Callum. He arrived with the energy and slight performance of a 22-year-old who is trying not to let on how moved he is by something. He shook Callum's hand and said, "So you are who my DNA found." And Callum laughed, the first time I heard him laugh properly, a real one, unguarded, and said, "I suppose I am." They got on immediately. The ease between them arrived before any of us expected it, and settled in as though it had always been there, which perhaps, in some form, it had. I visited Callum's workshop in Fenwick the following spring. I had wanted to see him work. There is something about watching a person at work that tells you things about them that conversation alone cannot reach. The particular quality of their attention when they are absorbed in something. The way their hands move when they are doing something that feels natural. I sat on a stool in the corner of his workshop for 2 hours and watched him shape a piece of oak into the leg of a table, and I understood something about him that I am still not sure I have words for. He makes things that last. He makes things meant to be used by more than one generation. I do not think this is an accident. Bernard and Eunice Marsh. I want to tell you about them because they are part of this story, and a particular part of it that I find myself thinking about with something close to gratitude. They had never lied to their son. They had told him from the beginning what they knew, and had encouraged him, when the time came, to find what they did not know. When Callum told them about the flight and about me, Eunice had cried, and Bernard had been very still and then said, "Bring her to meet us." When I came to Fenwick and walked into their house on a Sunday afternoon, Eunice took my hands in both of hers and said, "We always hoped there was someone like you somewhere." I had not expected to need that. I needed it. Harriet has had more good days since that Thursday in the garden-facing room. The doctors cannot say whether this is coincidence or the specific effect of something having been set down that she had been carrying for a very long time. I prefer to believe the latter, even if I cannot prove it. Callum visits her regularly now, once a month, sometimes twice, driving the 3 hours from Fenwick because he has chosen to, without being asked. She calls him by his name now. She reaches for his hand when he sits beside her. The first time she called him by a name, it was not Callum. It was a name I did not recognize, a name she must have had for him in the 3 days before he was taken to Fenwick. A private name, held in her memory all this time like something pressed between pages. He did not correct her. He sat quietly and let her call him by it. I was not in the room when this happened, he told me afterward, but I have thought about it many times, and every time I think about it, something in me goes completely still. I have been asked, by people who have heard versions of this story, whether I am angry. Whether the anger is at my father for the decision he made, or at my mother for the silence she maintained, or at the specific shape of a world in which a man in financial difficulty could give away one of his newborn children and call it a practical decision. The honest answer is that the anger is present, in varying intensities on different days, and I have stopped expecting it to fully resolve. But it lives alongside something else, something I find harder to name, but which is more constant and more useful. It is the specific wonder of the thing that happened on the flight. Out of every possible morning, on every possible route, on an aircraft that holds 200 people, a seating algorithm placed my twin brother in the middle seat beside me. I find that I cannot entirely reduce that to coincidence without losing something I would rather keep. And so here is the last thing I want to ask you, and it is a question I do not expect you to answer out loud, only to carry with you a little while after this story ends. Is there something in your own life, not necessarily a person, Not necessarily something as large as what I have described, but something, some question you have stopped asking, some door you decided was closed, some absence you made peace with before you fully understood its shape. I am not saying the door is open. I am not saying there is a man in the middle seat waiting to hand you a photograph. I am only asking whether the question is still there, underneath the peace you made with it. Because mine was. For 40 years it was there, and I did not know it, and then on a Tuesday in October it said my name. My name is Lenora. My parents told me my twin brother died at birth. He did not die. He grew up 300 miles away and learned to make furniture with his hands, and carried a photograph of the four of us in his jacket pocket for 2 years. And then one Tuesday, the seat beside me on a flight I had taken 40 times was given to him, by an algorithm that did not know what it was doing but did it perfectly anyway. If you are someone who is missing a piece of your own story, someone who was told something about their own life that they have always, in some unexamined corner of themselves, wondered about, I want you to hear this. The pieces are findable. Sometimes they find you. Sometimes they sit down beside you in the middle seat and say your name. You do not always have to go looking. Sometimes you only have to take your headphones off and turn around.